Hi, good morning. Good to see everybody here once again. We're going to be in John chapter 7. John chapter 7, and we're going to be picking up in our study in the Gospel of John and in our overall study of the New Testament. We've been going verse by verse through the New Testament with the hopes that before the end of the century we will actually make it through the entire New Testament. So that's our goal. Hopefully we'll be able to reach it, but for right now, we're in John chapter 7. So we're going to be beginning in verse 1 of John chapter 7. And John chapter 7 is a very interesting chapter because what it does is it ties some themes back to chapter 1. In chapter 7, we're going to see Jesus Christ show up at the Feast of Tabernacles. The Feast of Tabernacles was the last of the three main feasts that the Jewish males were required to attend in Jerusalem throughout the year. The first one was Passover, the second one Pentecost, and then this one, lastly, the Feast of Tabernacles, or the Feast of Booths, it's called here in the New American Standard. But basically, it was a time to celebrate the harvest. It came around the time of how we render time between the last of September and the beginning of October, so around fall. And they would go and they would celebrate the great harvest that God had given them, the plenty that God had supplied them. And it was a great feast. It was a feast of celebration, of joy, of happiness. But it was also a celebration of temperance, in a sense, of soberness, of a sense, in that while they were enjoying the harvest, enjoying and celebrating God's bounty, at the same time they were living in these booths, or these temporary dwelling places, these makeshift dwelling places. Tabernacles is another way to render that. And they would stay in there, and you'd have, on top of rooftops, you'd have people in these makeshift shelters. Even surrounding Jerusalem, people would set up camp there. It was like a big camp out. Kind of reminds me of when I was in Boy Scouts, the Jamboree. That was a place where a lot of the different troops in the surrounding area would gather. And where I went, there was this huge field, and it would just be filled with tents of these different Boy Scouts who had come to that Jamboree. That's what it kind of reminds me of. If you went to Jerusalem, you just see all these different shelters, people living in them, and the purpose of that was to keep them humble. While they're celebrating God's bounty with the harvest, at the same time they're remembering where they came from, remembering that in the wilderness they lived in these types of shelters as they were traveling from Egypt into the land of promise, where God was providing for them. They didn't have the fancy homes perhaps they would have at particular points in their history. They had to live in these temporary shelters as they were traveling through the wilderness, and it kind of kept them grounded to realize that God's provision is there, not only in the wilderness, but also in the land of plenty, and it was a reminder for them. Now this ties to John chapter 1, because in verse 18 we read that the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And as we noted when we were in chapter 1, that word for dwelt in the original language means tabernacled. The Word became flesh and tabernacled among us. In other words, set up a tent referring to his physical body. It became flesh. That flesh was like a tent, a temporary shelter or a dwelling place that he lived in for a while before he went up to glory. Another reference to that is 2 Corinthians chapter 5, where the Apostle Paul speaks of our bodies as tents. He says one day, these tents will be torn down and we have a building waiting for us, a permanent dwelling waiting for us in the resurrection, but our bodies are seen as tents. And this world is seen as kind of like a campsite. We're just here for a little while. This is our wilderness journey as we're inside these tents, which are our bodies, and we're here for a short amount of time. And Jesus came and tabernacled among us. If you think of our bodies as a tent, he took up a tent as well to live among us, to interact with us, teach us, but ultimately redeem us from our sins. Now, how does that tie in with John chapter 7? Well, in John chapter 7, you almost have a reenactment of the incarnation of Christ. If you read it very carefully, there's a lot of similarities between Jesus going to this feast and also him coming in the flesh. So here at the Feast of Tabernacles, we're reminded of how he actually tabernacled among us in his incarnation, in him becoming flesh. We'll see in chapter 7 that his coming was delayed. As we go on and we read, we're going to see that even his brothers question, why don't you go down to the feast? He doesn't make it there until the feast is halfway over. We can see Jesus' incarnation as, in a sense, delayed, not from God's standard, but from our standard, right? Thousands upon thousands of years have transpired before Jesus was actually came in the flesh. Promised, prophesied for centuries before he came, but it took a while for him to get there, so it's kind of delayed. But also when he got there, there was people already, his brethren were there, and we saw also in chapter 1 that he came to his own, but his own did not receive him. When he comes to the Feast of Tabernacles, he's going to do it in a hidden way. Not everybody's going to recognize him. When he came in the flesh, not everybody recognized him as God in the flesh. A lot of people missed his coming and didn't recognize that this was the Messiah that they were waiting for. So there's a lot of similarities between this chapter with him going to the Feast of Tabernacles and his incarnation. We don't want to miss that as we go through here. So let's just start at the beginning of the chapter, and we'll try to look at the significance of a lot of these things. In verse 1 it says, "After these things Jesus was walking in Galilee, for he was unwilling to walk in Judea because the Jews were seeking to kill him." After these things, so chapter 7 verse 1, chapter 6 verse 1, and chapter 5 verse 1 all start with that phrase, after these things, after these things, after these things. And we've noted as we've gone through there that word after these things is a very general term in the original language. It could be a day, it could be a week, it could be months. It just means these happened after these things. Here we know because it references the Feast of Tabernacles that it's about 6 months from what John had just been talking about. In chapter 6 we read about this miracle of the feeding of the 5,000, which happened around the time of the Passover. It specifically says that it's around the time of the Passover. He feeds the multitude with 5 loaves and 2 fish. Gets into this discussion about, you must eat my flesh and drink my blood. And we learned that just means that we are to take him by faith, to take him in by faith. But it was after all of that, after a lot of people had left him, after a lot of people said, this is too hard of a statement, we're out of here. After this took place, some 6 months after it took place, we have these events taking place. But he's in Galilee. He was unwilling to walk in Judea because the Jews were seeking to kill him. The Apostle John is very intent on, or focused on, Jesus' Judean ministry. If you go to Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they're more focused on his Galilean ministry. John's more focused on the Judean, in the southern part of Palestine there, where Jesus ministered. And anytime Jesus isn't in Judea, he usually tells us why. In chapter 4, we're told that he went up to Galilee because the Pharisees had heard that he was baptizing more people than John's. At least his disciples were. And so he went up north to escape persecution. Now we have him specifically mention now why he was walking in Galilee, why he didn't minister more in Judea. Is because he would have been persecuted. The plan for him to be crucified at the right point in time would have happened too soon. And so Jesus is kind of hanging out in Galilee, but not just hanging out. He's doing some work. He's doing miracles. He's teaching. He's developing his disciples, his apostles, getting them ready for ministry. He's doing a lot of things, but he's doing it all in the northern part, which is a bit perplexing to his brothers, as we'll read. In verse 2, it says, "Now the feast of the Jews, the feast of booths, was near." So we already referenced that. In verse 3, it says, "Therefore his brothers said to him, 'Leave here and go into Judea, so that your disciples also may see your works which you are doing. For no one does anything in secret when he himself seeks to be known publicly. If you do these things, show yourself to the world.' For not even his brothers were believing in him." Now here, the brothers, it's a very kind of a generic term as well. Could mean literal brothers. It could mean his kinsmen. The language seems to suggest his actual brothers, his physical brothers. It would have been his half-brothers, of course, because Jesus' father was God himself. But nonetheless, these are people who are closely related to him. And they're questioning, why doesn't he go there to Judea and just display his power, his majesty in a very public way? And this becomes the first objection that we're going to find in chapter 7. In chapter 7, we're going to see a lot of objections to Jesus' ministry come to light. And what this will do will help us to bolster our faith. When you hear of objections to Christ, but then you hear how Christ meets those objections, it's a means by which we can strengthen our faith. And the Apostle John is all about strengthening our faith, as we've talked about. But here, what's being questioned is the hiddenness of Christ. Okay? His hiddenness. What do we mean by that? It means why is Jesus being so secretive? Why isn't he being more public? This is the question the brothers have. Hey, if you're here to be the Messiah or whoever it is they thought he was wanting to be, why be so secretive? Why not go to the heart of the Jewish people there in Jerusalem, do the miracles there, perform those very publicly, so that your disciples can see them and they can be they can grow numerically, but also be strengthened in their faith. They might be saying this skeptically. The language seems to suggest that they're just questioning Jesus, not because they really are trying to give him advice, but they're kind of questioning his whole approach to his ministry and his ministry itself. But be that as it may, they're saying, why don't you go down there and be public? Now, this becomes a great objection, one of the biggest objections that we have in our day to the existence of God. And it usually goes under the title of the hiddenness of God. And the argument goes like this. It says, if God exists, why doesn't he show himself? Why hide so much? Why does he hide behind the curtain? Why is it that God doesn't just appear in the sky? Why doesn't Jesus just appear right here? If God's ultimate goal is to get as many people to believe as possible, why doesn't he just appear to everybody? Everybody will believe. Everybody will be saved. It seems like it just seems more efficient to do it that way. Why doesn't God just appear? And this becomes, again, a great argument or a prominent argument against the Christian faith and against the existence of God. Why is he so hidden? If he exists, why doesn't he just appear? Well, we're going to see through this particular story at least two reasons why that would be the case. But we could think of others. As we think about the hiddenness of God, one of the answers to that objection is probably the simplest and maybe the most obvious for those who are familiar with Scripture, and that is we couldn't handle it. If God were to appear to us, he told Moses that no one can see my face and live. The glory of God, the majesty of God, the power of God, the greatness of God is so overwhelming that our fragile little bodies, our little temporary dwellings, our little tents wouldn't be able to handle it. We would just be so overwhelmed by the glory of God. If he was to appear, we would just flat out die. We would not be able to handle it. And so for that reason, if no other reason, that's why God doesn't just appear to everybody, doesn't reveal himself to the world itself. But we couldn't take it. The other thing is, even if we could live, even if he masked his glory, he appeared, but he kind of masked it just enough to where we could still live, it would disrupt our normal day-to-day lives, right? With God being hidden, we can go about our daily business and function normally without constantly being, having God physically just staring at us the whole time. We can go about our jobs, we can interact with in our relationships, we can go about our business with God hidden and that not be disrupted. So God can see how we would operate and test us and challenge us in that particular setting to where we will operate under normal functions, go about our normal business without that type of thing, that overwhelming presence always there. The other thing is that if God were to appear to us in that way, human beings, even without God appearing, we are so susceptible to idol worship. If God would appear, let's say he appeared not in his full majesty, but he appeared like a centaur or something like that, maybe a half horse, half human, or he appeared in some way. You know what people would do? You would see them lined up in Walmart, these different idols, and people would have these idols in their home, and they would worship these different images of God because they know what God looks like, and so it would become a part of idol worship. We just have that propensity. Even though we don't know what God looks like, we still are involved in idol worship. How much more so would that be the case if he were to appear? And then the last one is what I kind of alluded to before. It's with the hiddenness of God, with him being able to step back and not be so overwhelming, not being so looking over our shoulder all the time, that he can really challenge us and test our faith. He wants us to believe in him, not because we see some glorious vision or something like that. He wants us to believe him because we take him at his word. How much better is it if your husband or your wife or your friend or someone else believes you simply because they take you at your word? We value that more than always having to show them. Well, I went to work today. Oh, did you? Well, what's your proof? How do I know you went to work? That would get laborious. We want people to believe us at our word, and God wants us to believe him at his word. He doesn't always have to appear. He doesn't always have to show us everything directly. He wants us to believe him because we trust him, because we have faith in him, that sort of thing. So those are other reasons that we could give for the hiddenness of God. I'm sure there's a lot more. But now we'll focus more on the text and see what Jesus offers us in his hiddenness, or his being secretive in this particular situation. And it continues on in verse 3. He says, therefore his brother said to him, we already read that part, verse 6. So Jesus said to them, my time is not yet here, but your time is always opportune. The world cannot hate you, but it hates me because I testify of it that its deeds are evil. Go up to the feast yourselves. I do not go up to this feast because my time is not yet fully come. And having said these things to them, he stayed in Galilee. Jesus says, I'm staying hidden. I'm staying secretive. I'm not going out and being public and doing these miracles because it's not my time yet. I have a plan. I have a schedule. I have there's something bigger going on here than just me doing a bunch of magic tricks and people believing in me. There's a timeline here. There's a whole plan that he's following, an itinerary, divine itinerary that he's following. He's saying, my time has not yet come. Whether this is talking about his time to go to the feast, which it could be talking about, definitely would fit with the language here, or whether he's talking about his time to be crucified. That wouldn't happen for another 6 months when he goes to the Passover. Then he would be crucified. But his time has not yet come. He had a plan. And that's true when we think about the hiddenness of God. One day God will be revealed. One day Jesus Christ will be revealed. The scriptures describe the second coming of Christ as though him appearing in the heavens, and all the tribes of the earth will see him. They'll mourn over the fact that this is the one that we've been rejecting all of our lives. Every knee will bow. Every tongue will confess that he is Lord. One day Jesus will be fully manifested. One time at some point God's glory will be fully manifested. In the resurrection we'll all rise up before his glorious presence. Those who were faithful, whose names are written in the book of life, will enjoy his presence for eternity. It says we won't even have a temple. The glory of the Lord will be on us and around us so powerfully and so mightily that we won't even need a temple. And so there is going to come a time when God will fully manifest himself, when Christ will be fully manifested, but there's a timeline and there's a plan, and God's sticking to the plan. He doesn't work according to our plans, as probably a lot of us have figured out, against our plans or the way that we think things should work out. He's got a plan, and we put our faith in his plan that one day he will be manifested and we will see his glory. First John chapter 3, that's first few verses there, says, how wonderful it is, what great love the Father has had for us, that he has made us children of God, and such we are. And he says it's not yet appeared what we will be, but one day we will see him as he is, because we will be like him. And so we hold on to that hope and trust in him that will happen at the proper time. So the first thing we see here is that there is a time for everything, and God works according to his own schedule. The second one is found as we continue in verse 10. It says, but his brothers had gone up to the feast, then he himself also went up, not publicly, but as if in secret. So the Jews were seeking him at the feast and were saying, where is he? And there was much grumbling among the crowds concerning him. Some were saying, he is a good man. Others were saying, no, on the contrary, he leads the people astray. Yet no one was speaking openly of him for fear of the Jews. So here's the other answer to this whole hiddenness of God, or we could say the hiddenness of Christ. And that is to say, just because you don't see him there doesn't mean he's not there. Here he shows up to the feast. Everyone's saying he's there at the feast, but everyone's saying, where is he? We don't see him, but you know what? He was just as present there as whether they saw him or not. And so even though he's there secretively, he's still there. His presence was still among them. And this becomes a picture of, the last section we looked at is more looking to the future, but this is looking more at the present situation, right? Maybe God is hidden in a certain sense. Maybe Christ is hidden in a certain sense in our lives today. And there might be a lot of people who are looking around saying, where is he? 2 Peter chapter 3 says that a time will come when people say, where is the promise of his coming? For everything continues on since the fathers. Everything continues on as it is. Jesus is here. He is among us. His presence is here whether we see it or not. We operate on the assumption that for someone to be here, or for God to be here, somehow we have to see him. But that's the only way he can manifest himself. We want God to manifest himself in the way that we would like for him to manifest himself. That is visibly, physically, in that sense. That doesn't mean he doesn't manifest himself in other ways, in a hidden way. We can experience him through his creation. We see all the wonderful things that he's made. Romans chapter 1, in verse 1, he talks about how his divine power, his divine nature is all revealed through his creation. We can see the things that he's worked, the works of his hands, and see his presence, or his existence being real. But also we can experience him personally in our lives as he transforms our lives, as he works in our lives, as he uses us for his working and his power. There are a lot of ways in which he can manifest himself, even though it might be in secret. But a lot of people in this day and age are saying, where is he? And then there's also the two objections, or the two ways in which people are divided. It says in verse 12, there was much grumbling among the crowds concerning him. Some were saying he is a good man. Others were saying, no, on the contrary, he leads people astray. And that's where we are. Jesus is here. His presence is here. He's here abiding in his church. We abide in him. We are connected to him as the branches are connected to the vine. We are connected to Christ. His Spirit indwells us. We are his temple. We are his body. We are his manifestation on this earth. But while this is going on, while God, Jesus Christ, is actually present in the world through his church, still people are saying, where is he? Some people are saying he's a good man. Some people are saying, well, he's leading people astray. This is a good description of our current situation. And then verse 13, yet no one was speaking openly of him for fear of the Jews. And there's definitely a lot of that going on, not necessarily with the Jews, but people not speaking openly about Jesus because of their fear of other people, whether it's family, co-workers, whatever the case may be. So these are the two ways in which we can answer this question, why is Jesus hidden? One, he's on a time frame, or he's on a timeline that he's adhering to. He has a plan. One day he will be fully manifested. The other thing is just because we don't physically see him doesn't mean he's not here. Doesn't mean he's not present. So this is what we see here. So that's the first objection, his hiddenness. The second one is going to be his teaching. This is the second objection we find in John chapter 7 in connection to Christ. As we continue on in verse 14, but when it was now the midst of the feast, Jesus went up into the temple and began to teach. So the feast had already been going on for a while. Now he's getting up and he's starting to teach. Verse 15, the Jews then were astonished, saying, how has this man become learned, having never been educated? So they're saying, this man, I didn't see him at the seminary. I didn't see him at the university. I didn't see him over there. How is it that he's teaching out of the Old Testament? Where is he getting this? In the Jewish society at that time, especially among the leaders, the rabbis, they got their authority by who they learned from, who they studied under. So if you studied under some great rabbi, you had some authority, you had some clout. You were seen as, as we see the scholarly type people, that people really listened to what you had to say because of the education you had. Today we would say because they have a PhD or something like that. But Jesus didn't have any of those credentials, humanly speaking. But he did study under, and he did receive his teachings from someone so much greater than the rabbis, from God himself. And that's what he'll explain in verse 16. So Jesus answered them and said, my teaching is not mine, but his who sent me. If anyone is willing to do his will, he will know of the teaching, whether it is of God or whether I speak of myself or from myself. He who speaks from himself seeks his own glory, but he who is seeking the glory of the one who sent him, he is true, and there is no unrighteousness in him. And the Jews would have agreed with that, at least partially. yeah, if a person getting up to speak and they're just speaking from their own authority, it didn't really have a whole lot of clout, but they spoke from the authority of past rabbis, from other authorities, from the past established leaders in the Jewish community, then people would listen to them more. And Jesus is saying, I'm not seeking my own glory. I'm not standing up and just saying, yeah, out of this, I'm just making this up from a human standpoint. But I receive these things from God. I receive these teachings. These are divine teachings received from God himself. Not from a rabbi, but from God himself. And he says, if anyone is willing to do his will, that is God's will, he will know the teaching, whether it is of God or whether I speak from myself. And there we can make a little side point that oftentimes people reject the teaching of Christ, not necessarily because it's bad, not necessarily because it's false, but because they don't want to obey. When a person has a heart willing to obey God, who comes to God and says, Lord, I don't care what you reveal to me, I don't care what you ask of me, I don't care how difficult the teaching might be, how challenging the doctrine might appear to me, I want to do your will. And I have a desire to absolutely surrender my will over to your will. That person is going to be able to receive the teachings of Christ in a ready way. But someone who has a rebellious heart, who doesn't really want to obey Christ in the first place, who doesn't really want to obey God, they kind of want to do their own thing, they'll try to poke holes in the teachings of Christ, they'll try to negate any authority that Christ might have, and they'll try to dispose of the teachings of Christ and not really accept it. Sometimes the problem isn't intellectual. It's not that people can't logically understand what's going on. It's more a condition of the heart. They don't want to receive what's being taught because of the rebellion that's inside them. But nonetheless, this is his answer to this challenge to his teachings. Hey, you're coming and you're teaching us. You haven't taught under the rabbis. Well, Jesus is saying, well, I was taught by God. My teaching is divine. It comes from the Father himself. Now, the next challenge is his actions. Okay, so we've seen his hiddenness was a challenge that was presented. His teachings was a challenge presented. Now his actions. And it has to do with the Sabbath healing that he did previously in the Gospel of John. In verse 19 it says, did not Moses give you the law, and yet none of you carries out the law? Why do you seek to kill me? The crowd answered, you have a demon. Who seeks to kill you? Now this shows us there's a division even among the Jewish people. The religious leaders did want to kill him. This, coming from the crowd, shows that the crowd, the general populace, didn't necessarily want to kill Jesus. It was the religious leaders that were really driving that. They were the ones that were challenged by Jesus. If you're a regular Jew at this particular point in time, whether Jesus is the Messiah or not, may not affect you too much. But if you're a religious leader, his authority is challenging your authority. His following is challenging your following as people following you. And they became envious of Jesus' ministry. So the crowd may have been being honest here and saying, we don't seek to kill you. You're over-exaggerating the situation, they would say. But in verse 21, Jesus answered them, I did one deed, and you all marvel. For this reason Moses has given you circumcision, not because it is from Moses, but from the fathers. And on the Sabbath you circumcise a man. If a man receives circumcision on the Sabbath, so that the law of Moses will not be broken, are you angry with me because I made an entire man well on the Sabbath? Do not judge according to appearance, but judge with righteous judgment. So what's implied here is that one of the challenges here against Jesus was the fact that he did a healing on the Sabbath. We talked about this earlier in the Gospel of John. He performed a miracle on the Sabbath. If you remember the guy who was by the pool, Jesus told him, take up your bed and walk. And the religious leaders challenged him. That was seen as working on the Sabbath. And anyway, there was that whole miracle, and that seemed to set off the religious leaders to say, no, he can't be from God. His teachings can't be from God because he transgresses Moses' law by doing miracles on the Sabbath. And so that was becoming a doubt within people's mind as to whether Jesus was really legitimate or not because he had performed this miracle on the Sabbath. But Jesus brings out the hypocrisy in that and saying, hey, on the Sabbath, you allow a person to be circumcised. According to the law, they were to circumcise on the 8th day. When a baby boy was born on the 8th day, that's where the circumcision was to take place. And if that fell on the Sabbath, they would go ahead and circumcise the child. And clearly, circumcising someone could be seen as a work. But they were challenging Jesus, who wasn't circumcising someone, but was actually making someone well, was saving somebody from an illness. And so Jesus is bringing out the hypocrisy. Why can you circumcise on the Sabbath, but not allow me to heal on the Sabbath? There's no transgression of the law. If I transgress the law, you guys are transgressing the law, and you're trying to keep the law. And so they challenged him by his actions as well. And he answers those challenges. In verse 25, so some of the people of Jerusalem were saying, "Is this not the man whom they are seeking to kill?" Again, probably alluding to the religious leaders. Verse 26, "Look, he is speaking publicly, and they are saying nothing to him. The rulers do not really know that this is the Christ, do they? However, we know where this man is from. But whenever the Christ may come, no one knows where he is from." So here we have yet another objection against Jesus. That is, they knew where he was from. By this time, it had already become kind of a common belief that when the Messiah came, he would appear out of nowhere. And there was different schools of thought on that. Okay, so we're going to find later on in this chapter that there were some who believed he would be born in Bethlehem. We saw that with King Herod. Some people knew that he would be born in Bethlehem. There were some who believed, yeah, we know where he's going to be born, we know where he's going to come from. But then there were others who said, no, we don't know where he's going to come from. They would lean more on the passages from Daniel that kind of talks about the Son of Man as though this vision that Daniel had, the Son of Man just kind of seems to appear out of nowhere, up in the clouds with the Father and things like that. And so there were some within the Jewish community who believed, no, we're not going to know where the Son of Man comes from. He's just going to kind of appear out of nowhere. And we're not going to be able to trace his life back to a birth or something like that. And those who believe that the Messiah should have just appeared out of nowhere, they're the ones that are challenging Jesus. They're saying, we know where this man is from. We know he's from Galilee. They probably knew maybe his family, things like that. Well, Jesus answers this challenge in verse 28. Then Jesus cried out in the temple teaching and saying, "You both know me and know where I am from. And I have not come of myself, but he who sent me is true, whom you do not know. I know him because I am from him, and he sent me." So he's saying, notice how he doesn't really go back to the virgin birth. He doesn't go back to Nazareth or Galilee. He takes it all the way back to the source, from the Father. I've come from the Father, and he is true. And he says, whom you do not know. I know him because I am from him. So he came from heaven itself. He came from the Father himself and had come. He knew where he had come from, even if they had completely missed it. In verse 30, so they were seeking to seize him, and no man laid his hand on him because his hour had not yet come. But many of the crowd believed in him, and they were saying, when the Christ comes, will he not perform more signs than those which this man has? Will he? So they wanted to kill him, but God was preventing it from happening. This is a major theme within the Gospel of John, this whole idea of everything working according to the plan of God. We'll see this even more so when it comes to the Garden of Gethsemane, the things connected to that with his crucifixion and things. John's very careful to show that this is all happening according to the plan of God. This wasn't some tragedy, Jesus being crucified. It was all a part of a plan, a bigger plan. But some people are believing. The crowds are kind of going back and forth. But Jesus answers this challenge about where he is from by saying, I'm from the Father, is basically how he answers it. In verse 32, the Pharisees heard the crowd muttering these things about him, and the chief priests and the Pharisees sent officers to seize him. Therefore Jesus said, for a little while longer I am with you. Then I go to him who sent me. You will seek me and will not find me, and where I am going you cannot come. Verse 35, the Jews then said to one another, where does this man intend to go that we will not find him? Is he not intending to go to the dispersion among the Greeks and to teach the Greeks, is he? What is this statement that he said, you will seek me and will not find me, and where I am you cannot come? So yet another objection, another challenge that the crowd had. Not only from where he came from, but also where he's going. So he mentions this idea of going to him who sent me, going back, you're going to seek me, you won't be able to find me. What is he talking about? We'll find later on that it's not just these people in Jerusalem who are challenged by this, but even his own disciples are. And that night before he is crucified, this gets brought up again. In verse 5, give you the scripture reference. John chapter 14, there Jesus says, in my Father's house are many dwelling places. If it were not so, I would have told you. For I go to prepare a place for you. If I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you to myself, that where I am, there you may be also, and you know the way where I'm going. So there again, he brings up this idea of going somewhere, going to the Father to prepare a place for them. And Thomas is challenged by it. Thomas said to him, Lord, we do not know where you are going. How do we know the way? And Jesus said to him, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but through me. So here he's being consistent. With the Jewish people here in chapter 7, he's saying, I'm going back to the Father, is basically what he's saying. When he's talking to his disciples on the night before he's crucified, he's also saying, I'm going to the Father. And the disciples would be able to go with him. We are able to go with him to the Father. He's prepared a place with the Father for us, and he is the way, the truth, and the life. And he's the one who prepares that for us so that we can abide and live with God forever. But that's where he was going. But they were challenged by that. They didn't understand that. They thought maybe he was talking about going to the dispersion. The dispersion is just the Jewish dispersion. At that point, there weren't just Jews in Palestine and Judea and Galilee and what we would call the land of Israel right now. But they were spread all over the known world, basically. So he's saying, is he going out to that dispersion? Is he going out to the Greeks? Where is he going? But no, he was talking about going to the Father. Then in the midst of all these challenges, challenged by his hiddenness, challenged by his teachings, challenged by his actions, challenged by where he is from, challenged by where he is going, there's a lot of confusion, a lot of division among the people. People are confused, they're perplexed, they don't understand. Jesus offers them something real, something that will help them in this situation. Verse 37, now in the last day, the great day of the feast, Jesus stood and cried out, saying, if anyone is thirsty, let him come to me and drink. He who believes in me, as the scriptures said, from his innermost being will flow rivers of living water. But this he spoke of the Spirit, whom those who believed in him were to receive. For the Spirit was not yet given, because Jesus was not yet glorified. So in the midst of all this confusion, division, Jesus says, look, I got something to offer you. If you're thirsty, come to me and get something to drink. He says, if you come to me, out of your heart will flow rivers of living water. I can satisfy that inner longing within you, that thirst within you that cannot be satisfied in any other way. And in the context here on this last day, the great day of the feast, what they would do is at the top of the steps of the temple, they had this big basin of water. And what they'd do is they'd pour out that water over the steps of the temple. And that was kind of to demonstrate what was taught in Joel chapter 2 about one day the Holy Spirit would be poured out on the nation of Israel. And there, at the last day, I can only picture this big basin being poured out over the steps of the temple, and then Jesus stand up and saying, if anyone is thirsty, come to me and drink. And out of his heart will flow rivers of living water, all the while speaking about the very Spirit that Joel was prophesying about. Basically saying, I'm the fulfillment of this thing that you're doing, this tradition that you have of pouring out this water. I will pour it out, but it'll be something more substantial, more real. It'll be something that will come from your very being within. And you can be totally and absolutely satisfied in me. And that's something that we have to remember. We ourselves might have a lot of objections. We might have maybe a lot of concerns, a lot of conflict within us, things we don't completely understand about Christ. Maybe there's challenges that we have. Maybe we're challenged by how hidden he is. Maybe we're challenged by other aspects of his ministry, his way of working with people. But one thing we cannot deny is his satisfaction in our lives. In the midst of doubts, of questionings, of not completely understanding what Jesus is all about and all those things, one thing we can bank on is that he can satisfy us from within. And when he comes to us and gives us that sweet satisfaction of life, when he fulfills us and when he works in us in such a way that we say, yeah, this is what life is all about. This is not only life, but this is abundant life. And now I have purpose. Now I have meaning. Now I have God himself abiding with me. That can be the answer to our objections. To say, well, I don't understand everything necessarily. I may not have it all, my doctrine completely straightened out in my head. But one thing I do know, Christ can satisfy me like nobody else can. And I want to come to him and drink of him and be fully satisfied in him. And let's keep in mind too this Exodus motif that's being stuck with here, right? Out of a person's heart will flow rivers of living water. What happened in the wilderness? They struck the rock, and out of the rock came the water in which the Israelites were satisfied. The Apostle Paul told the church at Corinth that the rock that they drank of was Christ. And so you have that, and then also with the last chapter, with him being the manna, the bread from heaven. We have him being the manna. We have him being the water that fully satisfies. Christ is everything that we need. As we interact with this world, as we go through this wilderness of life, he is our satisfaction and the one that we can hold on to. And we are out of time this morning. We might come back to that verse next week and unpackage it a little bit more. But I think we have enough here to say, you know what, there are a lot of things about Jesus that people don't understand. There's a lot of things that are mysterious about Christ. But one thing that we can understand is that he is the one that brings us true satisfaction. And if we come to him with a willing heart, with an obedient heart, for one, we'll find out that, yeah, what he's teaching is true. But secondly, that he can fulfill our inner longings. And if you're here this morning and you want Christ to do that, you want to give your life to Christ and be satisfied by nothing other but Christ, we offer you that opportunity to do that now as you come forward and as we sing the song that Dylan has prepared for us.